We've all heard of close encounters of different kinds, ranging from lights in the sky to actual ET contact. But what happens when they get extra close? Today, we're sharing stories of alien sex. Welcome to Shadowland, everybody.
Welcome.
This is a podcast that shines a spotlight on stories of the supernatural, mysterious, eerie, and unexplained. Stuff like dark matter,
Portals,
Bermuda Triangle,
voodoo,
shadow people,
remote seeing,
contemporary dinosaurs,
skinwalkers,
ghost ships,
underground bases. Did I already say
echoes.
that?
I guess so. Echoes from the past,
Human pig hybrids,
creepypasta,
time travel,
stargates,
sex magic,
all that stuff.
all that stuff and more.
Lots more. I'm Christina Callery,
And I'm Seth Jablon.
and today we are talking about
Alien sex.
alien sex.
Or love, romance,
All of that.
extracurricular relationships with extraterrestrials.
Hookups, all of it.
Yep.
all of
Alien
it.
hookups, alien probes. I imagine will probably be in here. Are they? I don't know. We'll see.
All right.
Yeah. So yeah. Do you want to go first?
I can go first.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, so I have two stories,
Okay.
and mine are kind of international.
Okay.
So I feel kind of like we need to put some sexy theremin music in here.
Okay. Yeah, that'd
So I
be
don't-
good. Yeah.
Tim, if you can make that happen.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. So my first story comes from China, and the person that this happened to, his name is Meng Xiaoguo, I think. But anyway, in 1994, Meng is a logger, and he was working in the Red Flag logging camp, or commune in northeastern China. And so he's outside, and he sees what he described as something metallic kind of shimmering on the side of one of the nearby mountains in the mountain ranges. It's the Dragon Mountains. So at first he thought it might be a helicopter that had gone down, and this was like, the glint of the wreckage on the hillside, and he decided to go over and check it out to see if he could salvage any scrap metal. So he made his way over, and when he got near to what he thought was the wreckage, he could see this in the distance, so it existed. And he is quoted as saying, "So at this point, something hit me square in the forehead and knocked me out." So he remembers something striking him in the head.
Like the
he
blow
goes down,
said or something. Yeah.
doesn't remember anything else. But when he came to, he's back at home, inexplicably. He is confused. At first, he's unable to communicate, and he has no memory of how he got home. So it's a complete blackout. Side note, after this experience, he developed an extreme phobia of anything made of iron, which is very interesting.
Huh. Okay.
So, but one night after this, things got even weirder. He was at home, sleeping in bed next to his wife, when he woke up to find himself floating in midair. And then what he described as a 10-foot tall female humanoid
Whoa.
walked into the room. And he said that she had 12 fingers and braided hair on her thighs. So it's this unique alien style. So she goes over to his bed and straddles him, and they had sex for around 40 minutes.
Whoa.
While-
Okay.
while-
in the air? Was he still in the air at this point?
Yes, while levitating,
God.
while his wife was sleeping peacefully directly beneath them. So this is like a 40-minute sex session. And apparently it was pretty rough because he said it left him with like a jagged 2-inch scar in his sort of nether regions. There was one interview that he did where he showed the reporter, he kind of like unzipped a little bit and showed. So it sounds like it's his lower pelvis that had this scar.
Wow. Okay.
So after it was over, this woman disappeared through the wall, and he like gently floated back down onto his bed. So one interviewer for the Huffington Post asked him to describe the alien, and he drew for them what the reporter thought looked like a hairy version of the Michelin Man. So that was kind of his vision. I'm going to try and find this. We can post it on our Instagram.
So she was like when you first said it, like how tall was it? Like 10 feet
10,
tall?
10 feet, around 10
So
feet
it wasn't
tall,
like
like
tall
3
and
meters.
skinny. It was like a big, huge creature.
Stocky,
huge creature.
strong. Yeah, yeah.
God. You know, it's so weird. The braided hair on the legs. I've heard that one before, like in was it some of those Point Pleasant stories? Like there was that school teacher who was brought aboard a ship. He was like walking home from school or something, got on a ship, and he had sex with the alien. He described like that she had very fine hair on her leg and it was all braided. Isn't that crazy? It's
Really?
such a weird detail. Yeah. Such a weird detail.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's a weird, I mean, that's like a pretty unique style, right? That's a really different trend.
Yes,
So.
totally.
Okay. So anyway, a month after this happened, he again woke up to find himself floating sort of over his bed, and he floated through a map of the world that was hanging over his bed and levitated out into a spaceship that was waiting there, where this group of aliens gathered around him. And he said that they were speaking to him in Chinese, but it was with very heavy accents, so it was a little difficult to understand them. But basically, they explained that they were refugees and that, quote, like me, they wanted to escape their former lives, so they left their dying home.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy. So at this point, Meng said that he asked to see his alien hookup from the other night. He was like, hey, where is she? Can I see her? And they said, and they said impossible. And then he's quoted as saying, but then they said something that made me hopeful. In 60 years on a distant planet, the son of a Chinese peasant will be born.
Wow. Okay, that's cool.
So,
I like that.
His space baby.
Space babies.
In 60 years. So it's like, what is that? Like 40 more years or so? No. Yeah, something like that. 50? No, 30. I can't do math.
Space-time is, isn't a definite thing.
Anyway. So. Yeah, so there's a long gestation period.
Wow, crazy. Okay. When did this happen?
Cool.
What was the...
This is in 1994.
1994. Oh, okay. So semi-recently. For some reason, it was just like, I don't know, maybe his job or something was making you think it was like more old-timey, but that's crazy. That's really...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like sort of rough sex, and then like, it doesn't sound very consensual either. And then also like hearing this sort of sad story of these aliens.
But he was looking for, so it gives me the impression.
Oh, that's true. Right afterwards, then he was like, "Well, that was like,
hey, can I see her?"
my pelvis scar is healing, so I could give it another shot.
Yeah. Okay. So this next one took place in Brazil. So, on the evening of October 15th, 1957, at around 1 a.m., 23-year-old Brazilian farmer Antonio Vilas Boas was out plowing the fields in his family's farm. Little did he know he would soon be plowing something else. I'm sorry, I had to.
Nice.
Okay. So, but he was working at night because it was too hot during the day. So he would often work outside at night and, he'd be able to concentrate on his own thoughts. It was kind of like a peaceful, sounds like a meditative sort of experience for him when it's cooler out. So he was on his tractor and suddenly he noticed a strange red star in the sky. And as he watched, it appeared to grow larger and closer until finally it cast sort of this pinkish light over the tractor, almost like a beam, like it was beaming down. And then it descended and it landed right in the field in front of him. And he described it as an egg-shaped craft with 3 spurs like a tripod that it rested on.
It's very Mork and Mindy.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Maybe that was the inspiration.
Yeah.
And it had a rotating light on the top, kind of like a ring of lights. And there was a hatch on the side. And while he was watching, this hatch opens and several strange looking beings came out.
Okay. Cool.
So at this point, he's like, fuck no. So he was pretty scared, and he tried to start the engine of his tractor to make a getaway, but the engine died. So then he got off the tractor and he's trying to run away. But just then he's grabbed by a small creature in a uniform that kind of looked like a diver's suit and goggles. So he pushed the creature away. It's pretty small. He's this 23-year-old, young, strong dude. But then he was grabbed by 3 other beings and taken up into the ship. So,
And that's where the magic happens.
that's where the magic happens. So once on board the ship, he found himself in this small room with shiny metal walls and ceiling and what looks like fluorescent lighting all around the walls. Kind of what you'd expect, right?
Right. An alien sex den, as it were.
Yeah. So 5 of the creatures restrained him and took him into what was like some kind of decontamination room. The room had he described it as having a support beam that went from floor to ceiling. And there was a table in there, and it had several stools, like one-legged stools. So I guess their furniture design was kind of similar
Okay.
to ours.
It was very Danish. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of Danish, minimalist. He said that the beings were all wearing these similar seamless one-piece suits that look like diver suits, and they were gray. The suits were, and covered the creatures from the neck down to their feet, and that they also wore these helmets that were attached to the suits with metal plates, and they had on eye coverings that had this goggle-like look to them. And the helmets were big, so it was pretty clear that their heads were larger than human heads based on the size. And at the top of the helmets, he said there were these 3 tubes that extended out and kind of behind and back into their suits. So these like tube-like apparatus thing, maybe for breathing, something. And then they were also wearing these really weird shoes that he described as thick-soled, like jester shoes with turned-up toes.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of like a little design flourish going on that
Yeah,
I wouldn't have
usually
expected. I mean, like, what's that for?
I feel like usually these aliens are like wearing like real minimalist, like
Right, yeah.
constructivist outfits, and like these
Yeah.
are like pretty elaborate. Okay.
Yeah. So while all this is going on, they're talking to each other, and he described their language as sounding kind of dog-like, with like these grunts and growls and bark-like sounds. And they're talking to each other while they're, restraining him, and they start to forcibly undress him. And, he tries to fight them off, but he ends up naked anyway. They get all his clothes off, and they gave him some sort of a sponge bath with what he described as like a clear, odorless, thick liquid. And then after the bath, they took him into another room that was a little larger, and it had some lettering above the door. And this is kind of fascinating. He said there were these like squiggly red symbols in a language he didn't recognize, but he claimed to memorize these symbols and was able to reproduce them later for investigators. I'm going to try to find that for our Instagram.
Oh yeah, that would be great to see.
It would be super cool. So they then did this weird, kind of procedure on him where it seems like they drew blood from him, but they used kind of like these thick pipes. And then they left him alone in the room. So Antonio sees a table kind of in one area of the room. And as he gets closer to it, he sees that it's kind of a cot, with no headboard or anything like that, but it's got a very soft, comfortable material. So he lies down on it. He's had a pretty tough day. But then he realizes that there's this strange gas being piped into the room, and it starts to make him feel sick, and he ended up, having to get up and vomit in the corner. And then after this happened, he's suddenly joined by this strange-looking woman. She comes into the room, and she's, he thinks she's pretty hot. She's completely naked. He described her as having almond-shaped eyes that extended farther around her head than human eyes do. So I think, imagine they like go kind of off to the side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she had high cheekbones, blue cat-like eyes, an oval-shaped face, and a pointed chin. And he said she had hair that was a silvery blonde color, but it seemed like it was bleached because her armpit and pubic hair were bright red. So not doing any favors for the redhead brand.
Yeah.
Again. So anyway, this woman approached him and she just gets right to it. She pressed her body up against his, and he said that he instantly started feeling aroused. He said, I began to get excited. I ended up forgetting everything and held the woman close to me, corresponding to her favors with greater ones of my own. It's a direct quote.
Okay.
Yeah.
Steamy.
Yeah. So it gets, steamy. So the alien lady didn't kiss him. According to some reports, it seems like she didn't really have lips, but she did bite his chin and make animal noises while they were getting it on. And then after it was all over, she looked at him, smiled, and pointed to her belly and then up toward the sky before disappearing. Kind of like, hey,
Right.
I'm going to have your space baby, and it's going to be
Right.
raised in space.
Right.
So like, although he enjoyed the sex at the time, it really seems like it. It
Yeah, it
sounds
sounds pretty
like,
hot. Yeah.
yeah, like, but it seems like afterward he sort of, had some regret. It seems like he felt used and maybe like a piece of space meat, because he said all they wanted was a good stallion to improve their stock. After the alien woman left, Antonio went into the next room in the craft, and all the other aliens were gathering around. They're talking in their weird dog language, and they were sort of ignoring him. Pretty rude. But so he's like, okay, I'm here. I'm going to take a souvenir. I'm going to prove to people that this actually happened to me when I get out of here. And he saw this strange clock-like thing. He didn't know what it was, but it looked like a clock. So he decided to steal it. So he reaches out to take it, and one of the beings saw him doing this, and then they're like, okay, you got to go. And they kick him off the ship.
Okay. All right. That kind of sucks.
Yeah, it does kind of suck. So then the ship shot up and off into the night sky. Okay, so this gets even more crazy. He did get kind of a souvenir, but not the kind you'd really want. So in addition to having some really super understandable PTSD-like symptoms, he had nightmares about being abducted again and so forth, and, fears of them coming for him. He started finding these strange reddish burn marks on his body and suffering from all kinds of really strange symptoms like extreme fatigue and headaches and nausea and other really odd things. And he went to some local doctors and was examined and was basically found to be healthy in spite of the, except for the fact that he had these weird burn-like marks. But then he went to see a professor at the National School of Medicine, and his name is Alago de Fontes. And he was also a pioneer in Brazilian ufology. And so De Fontes believed that Antonio was suffering from some kind of radiation poisoning, which would really substantiate that he had this experience.
Right.
Because how is this farmer, who's living out in the middle of nowhere, going to have this,
Yeah, I mean, it substantiates
this kind of
that
thing.
something happened, something intense to the body.
Something happened, yeah. So Antonio went on to get a college education. He became a practicing and very respected lawyer. He married and had 4 children, and by all accounts, he led this very dignified life. He wasn't, given to trying to court the press and get publicity or anything like that. In fact, he kind of like didn't really talk too much about it, but finally in 1978, which is like over 20 years later, he agreed to be interviewed on Brazilian TV just to set the record straight. Because there were so many rumors flying around, and he's like, okay, I'm going to be the one in charge of my story and this narrative. So he basically stuck to his abduction story throughout his entire life, never diverged from it. And sadly, Antonio eventually passed away in 1991. And some sources claim that it was from a mysterious illness that was never really diagnosed properly. And he even came to California to be tested at a medical university and passed away shortly afterward. And supposedly they didn't know what from.
Huh. Wow, that's a crazy story. I mean, I feel like a lot of these stories, the aliens seem sort of very high tech. Like the descriptions of technology and the experience seems very like, like they have a sort of mastery of time and space. Whereas this one, like, it kind of seems like everything's like kind of janky, down to the fact that he ended up with this sort of illness, right? Like that
Right.
they were in these like weird suits, and like that the fact that they were using gas, you know what I mean? It sounds
Yeah.
like, it doesn't sound like the most, as far as like alien sex abductions, like, it doesn't, it sounds like pretty low tech and sort of like brutal, right?
Yeah. For sure.
Interesting. Cool. Okay. All right. Well, are you ready for mine?
I'm so ready for yours.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm really excited about this one because this is one that I definitely learned in the process of, doing this episode. And like, I'd not heard about this, and I'm pretty excited about it. It's like definitely like kind of different, I think, in a lot of ways, than most abduction stories in general, and certainly within this category that we're doing tonight. But yeah, I mean, so this is the story of David Huggins.
Okay.
So there's a lot of like sensational headlines I could give to this story, but it's so epic and so like strangely heartfelt that I kind of just want to like do it all from the beginning. Okay,
Okay.
so get ready, strap in, because this one's a doozy. Okay.
Okay. I'm ready.
Okay. So David's story actually begins in the summer of 1951, when he was 8 years old. And at that time, he was living on a farm in rural Georgia, where he began having a series of encounters. So it all began one day when he was playing by a tree near their barn, and he heard a voice from behind him say, "David, behind you." And when he turns around, he sees a strange, short figure covered in a thick brown hair with large glowing eyes. And when he looked into its eyes, he found himself unable to move. He was sort of captured by it, right? So then at some point, he's able to break away, takes off. But that later in that afternoon, he goes back to that spot to, where this being had been, right? Like, he's like, did this happen? Like, so when he gets there, the creature steps back out of the woods. Understandably, he's super terrified, runs back to his house. But this would not be the last time he would see this creature, and he began calling him the hairy guy. So that same night, he awoke in his room and looks out of the window, and there he sees in the tree a very large owl with large glowing eyes. It was staring directly at him. And then later he dreams of tiny men coming into his room, and when they got close to him, the dream ended. And this happened repeatedly over the next few nights.
With the owl too?
Yes, I think these little men and just, yeah, like these eyes, and just, I'm not sure exactly which sequence, but the events like this with this sort of cast of characters started happening to him, including one afternoon when he was playing. He went down to the barn to get his softball, and he hears this sort of scraping sound from the other side of the barn. So he goes around to investigate, and there he says he saw a very tall, praying mantis-like creature. It stared at him and then proceeded to spray him with some kind of bluish gray liquid. And so he makes a run for it, and sort of notices that the liquid sort of quickly absorbing into his, into his clothes and on his skin, but it leaves no traces. So this is another creature that he would again see many, many, many times. And he refers to him as the insect-like being. Okay. So next, according to David, the land around his home was once a hunting ground for Native Americans. So David himself was part Native American. I think one of his parents might have been full or part Native American, and the other one was also. And I'm not sure if their sort of ancestry was sort of connected to that area, but he would often go hunting around there for arrowheads. Anyway, he could often, find them around his farm. So one day he's looking for them in the field behind his house, and suddenly he looks up and sees 8 small beings wearing blue jumpsuits floating down from the sky. So he described them as
Just from nowhere?
From
Just
nowhere.
There's
From nowhere,
no
just
craft?
literally
Okay.
like slowly floating, not falling, but like in a very controlled, and he said sort of soft and sort of graceful way, right? So he describes them all as small in stature with large heads, light gray skin, and huge almond-shaped eyes. Later he sort of acknowledges them as resembling, the often reported gray. But remember, this is 1951, right? Like,
That's crazy.
yeah.
I was even going to say the praying mantis thing is something that you see in alien lore again and again, too.
Oh, really? Yeah, okay. Maybe this is the first one I've like
Blue,
read. Where
also the blue jumpsuits.
the blue
I think.
jumpsuits? Okay,
Yep.
yeah. So,
I love a jumpsuit, though.
totally. Yeah, and so as the Greys sort of landed on the ground, as soon as they landed there, they began running straight towards him, right? And so that's a pretty crazy sight, right, for anybody. But especially I think he's still 8 years old at this point.
Terrifying.
Terrifying. So obviously he panics and takes off running. When he looks back over his shoulder, he sees his pursuers suddenly vanish into the air. And he said it was as if they became invisible, as if disappearing behind a curtain. So then later he sees them walking around his house, and he said he could look under the house. It was like up on blocks. So he could see their legs sort of milling about there. Then later that night, he woke up in his bed with a start. He looked at his bedroom window to find a big disc floating in front of a full moon. A group of Greys, probably the ones from before, were standing outside of the window looking in at him. And he said as soon as he made eye contact with one of them, he instantly felt his fear dissipate. And then so one comes up into the house, opens the door, and comes inside, and that's the next thing he knows. He's floating up through the air, held by 3 of the Greys, with another one sort of directing, sort of escorting them. And above them is the huge oval disc. He doesn't see any openings, just glowing light, right? And so all of a sudden, they're inside the craft. So then, he quickly finds himself in another room, right? And he's there with a group of Greys, and he says this room's kind of like a metallic room. It reminds him of a doctor's office. And he meets this woman who he will later call Crescent. And this woman will shortly become one of the most important people in his life. So now he's standing next to this small Grey who's about his height, and who he assumes is a boy like himself. And I don't know if that's because of his stature, if there was something childlike about him, but he asks the Grey if the big female being is his mom. And they both sort of smile, and he later, sort of describes this woman, believes her to be a hybrid. So he describes her as having very pale skin and large eyes, with small lips and a small nose, and that her hair was long and dark, but looked like a wig, as if she were trying to affect the appearance of a human woman. And he said, although her face was quite pale, that her body was like a normal human woman, and that her skin tone was not as quite as pale, but was sort of light, like a Caucasian. So there's like this sort of like gray white face, on this like sort of pinkish skin body. And he said many of the hybrids had this characteristic that, from the neck down, they appeared just like, Earth human beings. But from the neck up, they had this sort of face that resembled sort of the alien sort of face, right? And later, David paints them like this, and the paintings we'll definitely get into later on. Don't worry, but he often depicts them as fully nude or in long blue cloaks. So Aboard the ship, he also meets, this is like later on, right? He's on the ship for a while. He meets a very tall, almost human looking man. In one of his paintings, he's depicted him as almost like stretched out looking. He's so tall. And he's also wearing blue with a large bump, or almost like a phallus extending up from the back of his head, kind of like an antenna or something.
I'm sorry. Sorry, go
No,
ahead.
no, totally no. I mean, it's totally strange, right? So he took him over to the window and showed him Earth. David said he had an air of authority to him, and he believed him to be the one in charge. He said there's actually like there was a hierarchy among the species. He said the tall man was at the top, and the insect-like beings were sort of under him, but kind of in charge. Crescent, the woman hybrid, was sort of at the center of everything, with all the other hybrid women around her, and then the Greys he believed were like workers.
That's what I've heard too about there's like this hierarchy.
Right. There's like
And
a
the insect
special
beings are
hierarchy.
higher
Right.
than the greys and so
Yeah,
forth.
isn't that crazy? Yeah.
Like
So
a hive.
yeah, but then also like almost like it's like they're more evolved or something like that. But I'll come back to the Greys too, because there's something really interesting about them in relation to this story too. Okay, so he has many strange experiences with this full cast of characters, right? Like very often his stories have to do with this sort of squad of Greys, these insects sort of appearing. The tall guy, I think, sort of comes in and out, and he even says that one day when he's sort of playing around the tool shed, all of a sudden a Grey and Crescent appear, and they sort of shoo him away from the shed. And as soon as they do that, a black snake sort of slithers out from under it, right, preventing him from being bit. So they're like totally watching over him, and
On shape shifting.
or something. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Another occasion, he came. He's out playing in the woods, and he came across a tall brown alien woman sitting under a tree, who sort of beckons him over to him. There's still another where one of the Greys show him a baby inside of a glass tube, right? And he really doesn't understand the significance of this until much later. Like he's 10 years old at this point. Okay. So this goes on, I think off and on for a number of years, but I think there's some of them taper off. But one afternoon when he is 17, he again encounters Crescent in the woods. So it's summertime in Georgia, and he's off on his way to go swimming with some friends. And to avoid the sun, he's sort of taken this path through the woods. Suddenly he sees Crescent sitting under a tree. He's obviously scared at first, but he said he's quickly overcome with sexual desire, which is something that he had not experienced before. He was at 17. He's still a virgin. So she starts walking over towards him, and she tells him to lie down. He later said that he couldn't get his clothes off fast enough. She climbs on top of him, and he says the last thing he remembers before he passes out is how close her eyes were to his. And so he wakes up 15 minutes later and doesn't really recall why he's laying on the ground naked. And it would definitely be years before he actually remembered this experience. So a lot of the experiences he had, he either forgets them immediately, or they're sort of shooed out of his mind, or they're repressed. It's not really clear like what. There's definitely a point where they're like, erasing his memory or causing him not to remember, but then he'll remember and then forget. But later in his life, they all come back pretty clearly. Okay. So, fast forward a couple years later to 1965. He's now 19 and decides to get out of Georgia and make his way to New York City to study art at the Art Academy. And even though he's in the middle of Manhattan, it doesn't take him long to start having the experiences again. So, he has these like sort of strange encounters throughout his day. Like, he goes into this hardware store, and it's like this very strange interaction with this woman, and he has these really weird interactions. And remember, like he's sort of dealing whether or not these things are real. Some of it he can remember, but even when he does, he's like, is this really happening to me? He doesn't really understand what's happening to him. I mean, the memory of, his encounter with Crescent is very, very clear in his mind, but he doesn't really know who she is or what her deal is.
Well, plus, if you've been having these experiences since you're a child, you're going to question everything that happens, So encounters with strangers are going to be fraught with suspicion and
Yes.
what's going on here. I would
Totally.
imagine.
And you're not, I mean, you're going to, on the one hand, assume it's real because it's been part of your entire life, And on the other hand, it's all so strange that it's hard to really make sense of it. So anyways, after having some of these strange encounters one night, he sees Crescent's face in a dream. And that night she visits him and makes love to him. And so I use these words because this is how he characterizes it, right? So he basically said after a while, she became his girlfriend, right? He did date someone during that time, but once he started dating her, a number of Greys showed up to her apartment one night and stood by her bed, and the next day she moved out of New York City and never came back. So maybe
boy.
Yeah. So the nightly visit.
That's one way to make sure no one steals your man.
That's right. That's right. So the nightly visits become more and more clear, but he's still not really sure if they're dreams or not, right? Like he wakes up in the morning, it's just like, did that really happen? Right? She would just sort of like appear out of nowhere. Right? This is the middle of Manhattan, right? She would climb on top of him. They would have sex. He said her eyes were always glowing this sort of like hypnotic blue. He said there was always this soft glow in the corner of the room where one of the insect-like beings would stand there observing them. So,
ew.
Yeah, it's kinky. Yeah.
That's awkward.
Yeah. So this goes on for 5 years. Right, with Crescent visiting him 2 or 3 times a week. Again, he would wake up some mornings questioning whether or not this was like a dream or whatever. I mean, he believes it's real, but it's hard to believe this is happening to you, right? It doesn't make sense. So one evening when he's walking home, he noticed some beautiful flowers in the window of a flower shop, right? So it gives him this idea. He's going to get flowers for Crescent. And if she takes them with him, it means she's real. And if she doesn't, then he'll just use the flowers for painting, right? He's going to the art academy. Okay, so he goes home, puts the flowers on the bookcase before he turns in for the night. When he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't quite remember what happens right at first. But then he goes to school and he sees some students painting flowers, and the memory comes back, right? Something triggers it, and he remembers Crescent taking the flowers before she left. Now he knows like she's real, right? And so I think this whole exchange between them opened up something, right? Like in terms of the relationship, but also in terms of his relationship to this experience, right? He's clearly embracing it. So at this point, the experiences start getting even more clear. So David recalls that that night after, right, he's waiting for her to return, and he's going to bed, and he notices a shiny dot about the size of a quarter on the wall. And he feels this sort of strange energy, and it feels like his consciousness is being altered, but he's still very much awake. So everything becomes quiet. Even the sounds of the city ceases, right? Which you can imagine in Manhattan, like, it's pretty clear. It's like being out in the if you're staying at a cabin in the woods, that quiet can be, as loud as, a city. So very eerie, right? The spot starts glowing bigger and bigger and bigger until it's a quite large, bright hole in the wall. The insect being comes through, followed by Crescent, and he feels this very pleasant energy coming from her, right? So she starts coming towards him, and she I think she sits down in the bed or something, and she looks over at the bookcase and then back at David and smiles, like indicating, that she acknowledged this thing happened and that it meant something to her. And so she got closer to him and began rubbing her forehead against his. And so he says this is like how they kiss in her world. He says it causes this like deep, warm feeling. And I saw this film where someone's interviewing him, and he says, that everyone should try it. He says it's like a wonderful experience. But so they start
Kind of like cats do that.
Cats do that. Oh, that's right. They do that.
Head bump.
Yeah, that's right. So, speaking of cats, so and when they start making love, he says everything feels much more deep to him, much more, even romantic, right? And she begins making this soft melodic sound like a cat purring. And he basically says at this point they were in love, right? And so, the story is so great to me because like when he recounts it, he's not, he does it in this very heartfelt way. This experience and this, whatever relationship with whatever entity or whatever he had really meant something to him. And it was actually, there was terrifying parts of it, but largely it was this sort of beautiful experience. Okay. So there's so much more to this story that he recounts so many memories, so many paintings. But I think the climax of it all is when he is one day he's sort of awakened by them sort of talking to him through the portal, and he's sort of brought aboard the ship because one of this baby is dying, right? And Crescent's holding this child, and like he understands that it's his and Crescent's, right?
Oh no.
So
they can't save it. They can't do anything.
Well, she's like, the baby's dying or whatever, and he says, let me have it or something. They don't want him to touch it, but then he does, and that he said there's like this like jolt of electricity between him and the baby, like a almost like static electricity or something. He like touches it, and then as soon as he does that, it sort of revives, right? And so they're all like pretty happy about this. So one of the I think it's one of the insect beings is like, oh, okay, that's cool. So brings him into this other room where he sees dozens and dozens of hybrid babies in this nursery, right? And apparently he's told that all of them are his. And so he goes around to each one of them in the room and touches them. And he said he felt like he was imparting some of his sort of life energy to them.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like I said, there's so much more to this story. Like, I'm just going to give some more highlights. One of them is, he starts visiting, they start visiting him through the portal. And like, that's basically how he gets visits from them and visits them, right? Like, he's in the middle of Manhattan. So this portal opens and he steps through, and then it sort of closes behind him. There's one time where he he walks through the door and he looks out the window and he sees Earth, right? Basically that he's able to sort of like, what's that?
What are the details of how he describes this portal? Like, what does it look like? Is it kind of like what you see in the movies with the light, kind of like a black hole swirling?
No, it's like
spiral effect.
So it was the one where it starts as like a dot in the wall and it just opens up slowly and it's like a glowing light, but eventually it opens up so that he sees into the ship, and then when he steps into the ship, he looks back and he can see his bedroom.
That's really interesting because you know what? Near-death experience accounts a lot of times describe things that way when they're passing over to the other side. Yeah, seeing a light that like gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, and so he says he even visits them one time in a underground tunnel structure, right? I think actually when he goes and revives that baby, it's like he's not really supposed to go there, and they're sort of upset that he's there at first, but Crescent had sort of invited him in. But he said he's in this, like, one of the places he visits is this underground complex, which he believes is actually on Earth somewhere. Other times he's sort of visiting him on this ship. And he, on another occasion, he's actually introduced to these two very large hybrids, two women, who sort of indicate they want to have sex with him, and he ends up, having sex with them, but it's clear that they're trying to learn, like, sort of affections, learning how to, like, make love like a human in a way. Like he said, he's still being sort of observed, but he asks everyone to leave the room. And it's really, really kind of fascinating, all the sort of events that happen. It's not just these like single encounters, but he has this sort of whole life with them. And I think they even try to, like, I think they ask one of the insect beings if he can stay, and they're like, no, David has to go back. And so, yeah, and I think on another occasion, he says he sits in on Crescent, teaching a group of humans and hybrids. He doesn't know where these people came from, whether they were Earthlings or not, but they're all kind of sitting around in a room where she's sort of teaching them. On another occasion, he's given a book from one of the Greys with these like luminous pages that symbols appear and disappear. And he actually does a painting of, I think, one of them. And then one of my personal favorites is when a Grey takes a package out of a drawer on a spaceship. When they're in some room in the spaceship, and takes this package out, and it's composed of this transparent plastic bag, and inside is a gray alien sort of folded up like a suit. And he says, as soon as he picks it up, he said it sort of comes alive inside.
Whoa.
And it opens its eyes and its mouth, and it sort of taps on the inside of the bag at him, like indicating that, like, and he says he's made to understand that this was a quote body skin that the Greys used. Now, in this sort of...
Wait, so it's not alive? It's like a lifelike body skin
that they live in,
wear,
or something like that. Like Whitley Strieber talks about. He said in one of his accounts, he's taken into a room where he's shown these drawers full of like empty bodies, basically, of gray aliens, and he said he's sort of given to understand that their consciousness inhabits these bodies, and that they can sort of, they're almost like, their bodies are almost like vessels to them. Right? They have the ability to move in and out of these bodies and inhabit them. And so the Greys then, potentially wearing different body suits. And I think even at one point he sort of asked the questions whether they still use those suits. And then he sees that they're now wearing like more human-like suits, so that their bodies are like spacesuits almost. Isn't that crazy?
It's kind of like, it kind of begs the question of like, what dimension do these things come from?
Yes, totally.
Are they spiritual entities, or are they physical entities?
Right. Like, I mean, there's definitely a spiritual quality to the whole thing. And I mean, we've talked about how like people have definitely had spiritual experiences through more shamanistic means. And like some people consider these like interdimensional beings. And there's clearly a mastery of sort of time and space and of consciousness going on here. And so, are they more evolved, and that makes them on a sort of different spiritual strata of the world? Are they some type of spirit, right? And coming, into this world, right? Like, is this like, is this on our plane, or is it on another one? Like, it's all so, I think there's so many possibilities about what could be happening here, but certainly something is happening here, right? Something happened to this man that happened to him his entire life. And he's very matter of fact about it, right? But he definitely had his struggles. Like I think one of the most fascinating aspects of this story is all the paintings he made. So, this whole time he's studying at the Art Academy, which I don't know if you know, but it's this famous New York art school, especially for painting. And, over the course of his journey, has at times a hard time assimilating all these experiences. He talks about this one moment where he totally has this like meltdown, and they sort of help him through it, and they help, and I think as a part of that, at some point, one of the tall ones says, let David do paintings. Right. And so at that point he embarks on this decades long practice of painting all of his memories, which help him sort of recover them. Because I think up until the point of him being an adult, he hadn't really at one time held all these memories. They were kind of, he would have them and then things would stop happening. And so these doing these paintings actually help him remember, and it helps him remember more. And I've definitely, so I saw a film on him as well. There's also a book someone did of some of his work, and I think they're actually pretty beautiful. There's something very like soft and simple and sort of unadorned about them. They're like very stripped down and guileless, right? Like just like him. There's almost like this like folksy quality to them, but with a certain,
It's a very lovely description.
yeah, there's sort of a certain emotional clarity that makes you feel like you're witnessing something that happened, right? That you're peering in on this scene, right? There are all these scenes, and they're all very simple in a way where he's not painting anything that he can't remember. And I think he even talks about how every single painting is happened. He said he did one painting once where he made something up and they got very mad at him and he threw it out and never did it again. And so there's that quality to everything where there's like this simplicity where he's just trying to capture or make clear to himself what happened and how he felt. And there's like this softness in the colors. Like it's not like you think of like a painting of an alien, this like intense psychedelic fucking, like all these like artificial intense colors, but they're very sort of sweet and soft. And he actually had a show in Manhattan at some point. I sure wish I would have known that was going on.
Oh man.
I don't know if it was part of the documentary they were making about him, but you got to see the painting. So we'll definitely put them up, some of them up on Instagram. And then, David himself is very interesting. He's, just watching him in this film, he's very sweet, unassuming. He actually lives now in Staten Island and he lives a very simple life. He works in a deli, and he paints when he can. He's very matter of fact about it all, right? The way he recounts everything. Yeah, and there's something, I think, yeah, like I said.
I think we should have him on.
Oh my God, dude. I don't know.
Seriously.
I mean, he's definitely one of those people who have shied away from, talking about it. I think he's one of the people that talk about it as a means of himself just trying to deal with it, but he's never really done much with the press or, I think, there's been some, he's sort of shied away from, the media about it. But I think, like someone did a film about him. Like I said, someone did a book as well. But other than that, he's sort of quiet about the whole thing. And one of the filmmakers actually goes around and sort of talks to his neighbors and his friends. And it's really beautiful. It's like these it's like old, deli owner in Staten Island's like, he's like, well, do you think this stuff happened? He's like, yeah, why not? Like this, he's like, why would he lie about this stuff? Like you can tell like the relationships he has in his life, they aren't these, he has this, I don't know, there's this simplicity to him where he's not trying to insist on anything. He's not trying to make anybody believe him, but he's pretty clear on what happened to him. He actually had a son. I think he's divorced now. And I think his son's pretty clear on it all. Like it just seems like this is something that, he's still, his story to me is unique in a lot of the ways. And I think one of those is his relationship to it all, right? The way he talks about, Crescent and his sort of love and affection for her, these are like friends of his, right? And he doesn't, it's not this like, very heady Whitley Strieber thing where he thinks that they're trying to like teach him anything or really experiment on him in any way. And you definitely don't get the sense of him as a victim in any of this. Like he's not the victim of some crazy unseen force or delusion or something, like sort of unfortunately like that, the one woman you did a story on the ghost lover or whatever, where you're like something else is going on here and it's not healthy for her. And you know what I mean? Like you don't get that feeling about him. He's just this guy who's had these lifelong experiences and potentially.
Does he still have them? How did things end?
He does. Yep. He does still have them. And I think at one point, Crescent came to him a little later in his life and introduced him to one of his children who is now like a 6 or 7 year old or something like that. Yeah. And like sort of ceremoniously, like he like had them meet, but I think he says, their visits are less frequent, but he definitely feels this sort of like connection with them. So yes, that is the story of David Huggins.
Wow. That is epic.
Isn't it? Like,
yeah, I can't wait to see the paintings.
There. Yeah, totally. And like I said, like there was almost too much to do. There was too much to do in just sort of one sitting. It's like, yeah, he definitely has, quite a bit of ranging experiences. Yeah. So.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I mean, like,
Cool.
what do you think about all this stuff? Like, do you think people are having these like not
I
just
feel like
uh-huh.
it seems like they're very real to the people that are reporting them,
Yeah.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And when you have people that, it's verified by multiple witnesses that they're trustworthy
Mm-hmm.
and, not just attention seeking, I mean, something's happening to them.
Right. Right.
I
Totally.
just don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an
What do you
interview with.
think?
Yeah. I mean, I think there can be a lot of things happening here. Like, so they actually interview some type of comparative religions spiritualist guy, like a professor.
Hmm.
I'm not sure how he knew David, but he sort of studies the symbols of ufology, and he talks about like how we've had all these sort of like people have had all types of experiences, both spiritual on the sort of God level and just the level of like entities entering into the world and interacting with human beings, right? Even some of the original Greek stories, like all of those gods had sex with, humans, right?
Right.
Or a lot of them
Yeah.
did.
And
So,
in like the Old Testament in the Bible, there's
right,
like the Nephilim,
right.
which were, I mean, it was kind of more of a diabolical thing, but basically fallen angels coming to earth and having sex with women.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, whether, and he says, different cultures, these experiences, and we've talked about that on this podcast, right? Like these experiences, they can have a different outer visual expression, right? Like based
Hmm.
on like this, almost like the psychology of the people, or maybe they have their own independent, form to them, right? Like some people have reported seeing this blue or purple woman and DMT experiences, and even talked to her about other people, like met the same person. And so, I think there's potentially something interdimensional happening here, something spiritual happening here.
Right.
But I also don't really see like how far of a stretch it is that if there were other more advanced entities visiting here, that there would be some interest in that. I imagine if human beings, evolved to the point where they're sort of traveling around the stars and they're meeting compatible species, that there wouldn't be some scientific interest in that or non-scientific interest in that. You know what I mean? Just
Or space Tinder.
yes, exactly, exactly. So I don't really. I mean, it's no more far-fetched to me than
Right.
the idea of them being here in the first place, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I also think about like, bringing up the near death experience phenomena again. You know, there are constants in all of these reports
Right.
from
Yes.
all over the world and all different cultures, but there's like a different frame on each one. And so it seems like people see their experience and interpret it based on their cultural conditioning
Yes.
and their
Right. Right.
religious
Yeah.
beliefs. And so, maybe something like that's going on here too.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was, I think, one of this professor's points was like, now all the experiences are in this, you know, in this sort of visual language, right? But that doesn't, to me, like personally, I still believe that there are, you know, potentially, more evolved species that are visiting this planet and interacting with us in some way. And I think one
Hmm.
of those ways is, you know, is an interest in sort of humans' reproductive, possibilities.
So many of these stories actually go back to that, seem to point to that.
Yes, I mean, like part of the lore is that a lot of these species maybe have cloned over many years, or or just that human beings are a young race, or they're just looking at different ways of, like human beings did this. So just because, right? So we know now that back in the day, we didn't have this very clean this very linear evolutionary journey, right? Like early humans were like fucking everybody, right? They were having sex with Neanderthals. They were having sex with competing
Which is how
Homo
I'm
sapien.
here.
What's that?
Which is how I'm here.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The ginger genes.
Oh right. Oh right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 I mean, we all have some of that somewhere in us. And like, there's all the different haplogroups and all this. And like, now we know it's like kind of a mess back there, right? Like everybody was kind of fucking everybody until there was no one around not to fuck. So another species, then doing that we did that on this planet, right? We traveled to a new region. There was a competing species there, or there was an older one or a newer one, and people were having sex, right? Like if the parts fit together, they would do it, And so our evolution was inevitably influenced by that, right? And so imagining that then our species would move on to explore other planets, we would certainly continue that behavior. It's only natural, right? So cool. Yeah. Well, this was a super fun episode.
It was super fun.
I really enjoyed this story. I kind of feel like David's now like this is like now my like straight up favorite story. Like, like I love the ones where there's like a relationship over years, because it's more than just like a scary, like, whoa, this fucking crazy thing happened. It's like, but there's a certain depth and sort of heartfeltedness to this story that I love so much.
Cool.
All right. Well, I feel like we did it. Yeah.
We did it.
All right. So,
alien sex
and love.
There you have it. And love.
So, cool. All right. So I guess until next time.
All
right. Bye.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Shadowland Podcast is produced by Seth Jablon and Christina Callaghan. Edited by Tim Kelly. Theme music by Tim Lincoln.
Thanks, Tim.